Good morning everyone, hope you're doing well. I think I said last week when we were looking at World War II that I wouldn't be live today, so I am still here. The talk should still be going out at 11 o'clock as normal, and if you want to comment, tell us where you're watching from, tell us what your interest is in the Jacobites, anything like that. Please do comment as normal because another member of staff will be monitoring that and replying to you, so it should be exactly the same as normal for you. So this week, as I said, we're looking at Jacobites. What I'm going to do before I start on that is just to tell you a little bit about myself, just in case you haven't been involved in previous sessions. So my name is Lorna. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. And those of you who have watched previous sessions will know that my job involves speaking to school pupils, speaking to care home groups, all sorts of different audiences about the collections that we care for. If any of you don't know what archives are original documents. So we look after all sorts of documents to do with the history of the Highlands, and they date back to the 1200s through to the present day. So all sorts of different things that cover a really wide range, date range and subject range as well. So this week, as I said, we're going to be looking at Jacobites. If you want to have a look back at any of the other sessions we've covered, then please do go on to the Highland Archive Centre Facebook page where all the previous videos are. They're also available on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. And then all of them have linked activities, resources, documents up on our website, and I'll put the link into the comments on the video as well. So please do have a look at those as well. But as I say, this week we're looking at Jacobites. One thing I will say before I start this subject, which is one of my absolute favourite subjects that I talk about, is if you can lay your hand on a tree of the royal family, that would be helpful to you as you're studying this going forward. So you don't need to have one right now, but if you're coming to do more study on them, particularly if you're in a school group or not in a group as it is at the moment, if you're studying this at home as a school pupil, then it would be useful to you to have a tree to hand to look back at some of the things I'm saying. So obviously we're in 2020, it's probably a year none of us will ever forget for various reasons, but this is the 275th anniversary of the 1745 uprising and the raising of the standard at Glenfinnan, and we'll come on to talk about that in a little bit and what that means. Those of us who live in the Highlands, I know people are watching from all over the Highlands, from the rest of Scotland and also from across the world, but those of us who live in the Highlands will be very aware of the site of the Battle of Culloden. It's something for a lot of us that we just grew up with. We went there for school trips. We've always known that Culloden is there. But what I want to talk about today is, where does Culloden fit into that whole bigger picture of the Jacobites? What is that as the part of the story? Who are the Jacobites? What did they believe in? What were they fighting for? Where, when did all this happen? And one of the things I really want to do is kind of dispel a couple of the myths that people tend to have about the Jacobite uprisings. So, as I say, most people know about the 1745 uprising. That's the most famous one, but it started way before that. So the rebellion started really, and I say rebellions, that's also a kind of a dangerous, controversial statement, because they're rebelling against one thing, but some people believe that they were correct. So the Jacobite uprisings really started in 1688. And they were religious wars, so they weren't wars really about territory. They weren't an English-Scottish thing, which is quite a lot of people believe. These were wars on the basis of religion and on the basis of how the country should be run and governed. So it all starts with King James II and VII. So he was called that because he was the second King James of England, but he was the seventh King James of Scotland. So we had in Scotland 7 people called King James, and in England this was only the second King James, so he gets called the second and seventh. He was born in 1633, so that was 387 years ago, if that's easier to think of. Nearly 400 years ago. He was a Protestant, and he was married to a Protestant, and he had 2 daughters called Mary and Anne, and he raised them as Protestants as well. But then he married for a second time a lady called Mary of Modena, and his second wife was a Catholic, and so he converted to being a Catholic, and then they had a son who they raised as Catholic. Now, it's quite hard, I think, for us now to understand why people were so scared about the difference between Catholics and Protestants. Because for, I would imagine, all of us watching, that is not a frightening thing. That's not a thing that we understand really as a fear. Although I think that a lot of us have been, we've lived through a time where misunderstanding about different religions or not knowing enough about someone else's religion can be worrying. So that's a really a thing that has been continuous throughout our history. But anyway, at this stage, it was Catholics and Protestants that the fear and the confusion came about. One of the reasons that people were frightened of Catholics, or Catholic monarchs particularly, was that they believed in what was called absolute monarchy. So they believed that they had a divine right to be the king. They believed that God had told them that they were to be the correct king, and that therefore they had the authority to rule absolutely without needing to consult a parliament or anybody else. And so that was quite frightening for some people, because they thought that maybe their rights were going to be taken away, or they would be ruled by someone with a fist of iron. This was all fine when King James II and VII was a Protestant, and when he converted to Catholicism, that was okay because his two daughters were still Protestants and they were going to be the next monarchs. So that was, uneasy, but it was okay for people. Then when he had a son who he raised as Catholic, everything changed, because people thought, well, the son is going to be the next king and he's going to be a Catholic monarch. And that was maybe a little bit frightening for them. So by this point, James's daughter Mary, his oldest daughter, had gone away to Holland and married William of Orange. So the Parliament in Britain said, no, we don't want a Catholic monarch. We don't want the new baby to become the next king. So we'll invite Mary and her husband to come back, and they can be the next king and queen, and they can be Protestant monarchs instead. And that's what happened. And King James VII and II was forced to flee the country. He had to go to France. The story goes that he threw his big royal seal, his big stamp of authority, into the River Thames as he flew away from the country. And William and Mary came over and reigned. So like I say, there's a lot of people here and a lot of names, so it does help if you can follow this on a tree. So James had to go to France. William and Mary became the monarchs, and they were the only people that we've had who have been joint monarchs. They were king and queen together. And that was called the Glorious Revolution. But a lot of people wanted James to have the throne back. He had a lot of supporters, and they were called the Jacobites, and that's because Jacob is the Latin for James, so that meant that they were supporting James's cause to get the throne back. In the future, after William and Mary had reigned, after they both died, the throne then went to Mary's sister Anne, so James's second daughter Anne, and she was also a Protestant monarch. And so the country was fairly uneasily okay while she was on the throne. But then in 1714, she died, and this is where the big problems really start. Instead of the throne being passed then to the brother James, who was the little baby who had been born at the beginning, who was a Catholic, it passed to a distant cousin in Germany who was the nearest Protestant relative. And that's when it all really kicked off, because the law was passed that meant there couldn't be a Catholic monarch anymore. And so instead of going to the immediate next relative who should have been the next monarch, it went to a distant relative who had the right religion as it was seen by some people at the time. And so that new monarch was King George I, and that was when we moved from the House of Stuart to the House of Hanover, and that's when we start to have the Hanoverian kings. When he became king, he couldn't even speak English, and he'd never been to this country. So a lot of unhappiness. So that's the background to the Jacobite risings. There were lots of risings. 1688 to 89 there was a rising, which is immediately after King James VII and II was forced to leave Britain. So there was a rising then. There was a rising in 1715, one in 1719, and one in 1745. And I'll touch a little bit on all of them quickly. One of the things that's important to know is that these happened right across the UK and also wider areas as well. So there were supporters in Europe of the Jacobites. There were supporters in England of the Jacobites, and there were supporters in the Highlands of the Hanoverians. So it is not as clear cut as being an English-Scottish set of wars. It was very much on who they believed, whose cause they believed in, what their religion was, and who they wanted to rule, and how they wanted the country to be ruled. So as I said, I'm going to touch on them a little bit, but the first one I want to tell you a little bit about is the 1715 rising. And that's because, if you remember, Queen Anne died in 1714 and the throne passed to this distant cousin. Now, it had been okay for people while it was King James, and then it was his daughters, Mary and Anne. That was okay because it was still kept in the immediate family. But when the son James was cut out and the throne went to a distant cousin, people started to really be upset about it and not happy about the way it had turned out. And so that was when really there was a lot of risings. 1715 rising is not as well known as the 1745, but it's the one really that most people think should have succeeded, because there was a lot of support for the Jacobites at this time, and a lot of people wanted the throne to go back to them. So as soon as Queen Anne died in 1714, people gathered on both sides of the debate. Clans started to gather on both sides. There were families who were supporting both sides in the Highlands. So the Munros were on the Hanoverian side, and so were the Sutherlands, whereas there were other families who were on the Jacobite side. So the Mackenzies, the Macintoshes were on the Jacobite side, largely speaking. In Inverness, so the 1715 is kind of largely known for big battles like the Battle of Sheriff Muir, but because obviously my job is to talk about Highlands and the Highland documents that we look after, I'm going to focus on that. So in Inverness, the castle and the Tolbooth, which was the prison, were taken over by Jacobite garrison, and we have got all sorts of awesome documents that tell this story. So we have borough minutes that talk about, so that's the people who run the town writing about everything that's happening in the town, and they record how the castle was taken over by Jacobites, and how there was a garrison of soldiers there under the charge of Sir John Mackenzie of Coole. As I say, the Tolbooth was also taken over, the prison, and so there was a lot of questioning about why the people who ran Inverness let this happen. So maybe they were Jacobite sympathisers, we don't know. Our town council minutes, so that the notes written by the people running the town, show that Duncan Forbes of Culloden, who would become very famous later on, Hugh Rose of Kilrock, and various other people wrote to the town and said, you have to get the Jacobites out. There's no way the Jacobites can stay in this town. If you don't get them out, and I'm going to read a quote for you because I don't want to get it wrong because it's so awesome. They wrote a letter saying, if you don't get rid of all the Jacobites in the castle, then we will call you aiders, assisters, maintainers and comforters of rebellion, and you're traitors and enemies to to our sovereign King George. So that's quite a powerful letter. And then they also say, if you don't get rid of the Jacobites from Inverness, we will prosecute you with fire and sword and the utmost vigour of war. So we will burn Inverness to the ground if you don't force the Jacobites out. So, you remember one of the people who wrote that letter was called Hugh Rose. Now, his brother Arthur has an awesome story. We love Arthur. Arthur had been trading in Turkey, had been kidnapped by pirates, had been taken away to Egypt and held ransom, and then his brother Hugh had paid the ransom and brought him back, and he had come back to the Highlands in 1714. He was a supporter of the Hanoverian side, and so he didn't have time to wait for the people in Inverness to get rid of the Jacobites. He just charged in and tried to take things into his own hands, tried to get rid of the Jacobites who were taking over the Tolbooth jail. So he charged in, and we've got a letter that describes this. He charged into Inverness, burst into the Tolbooth, and for anyone who's watching in Inverness, the Tolbooth building is the big tall spire right opposite McDonald's, which for those of you not in Inverness, that's how we navigate. So he burst into the Tolbooth building to try and get the Jacobites out, but it didn't end well, and he was squeezed to death behind the door and shot, and so he died. And his brother Hugh was so angry with the Jacobites that he wrote a second letter saying, "That is it, I'm burning the entire town down if you don't get rid of the Jacobites right now." And that's what happened. The Jacobites fled away that night. And some of the documents that we've got for you to look on the website, we've got the letter about Arthur's death. We've got some claims for people whose houses were lost, whose goods were stolen and damaged during the Jacobite uprising. So they're all there for you to have a wee look at on the website. So the Jacobites gave up in Inverness and around the Highlands that day, which was the same day or 1 or 2 days within the Battle of Sheriffmuir, which the Jacobites also lost. So the whole rising just collapsed. There was a little rising in 1719 when people came over to land, the Jacobites came over to land on the west coast to try and take over again. It didn't go very well. Elandonnan Castle was burnt down to the ground as part of that rising, and again there's some pictures on our website for you to have a look at to do with that. So I'm going to kind of not touch much on that one because it was quite a small rising and not very successful, and ended in the Battle of Glenchere, which is another unsuccessful battle from a Jacobite point of view. So the last one I want to tell you about really is the big famous one, which is the 1745 uprising, which maybe you'll have heard about. So this is when Bonnie Prince Charlie, who in all my working days I refer to as BPC, but I will attempt not to. So Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the grandson of James II and VII, if you remember James who started everything back in the day, that was his grandson. So he tried to take the throne back for his family, and this was the last real time that there was an attempt to take the throne back for that line of the family. So he landed, he had been away in Italy and France and different places, and he came back, or came to Scotland in 1745. And as I said, this year marks the 275th anniversary of that happening and the raising of the standard at Glenfinnan. He raised support for his Jacobite army as he travelled through the country, trying to gain support, and there was obviously support for both sides again. So he tried to gain support for the Jacobite cause. He travelled through the country and eventually ended up meeting the Hanoverian army at Culloden on the 16th of April 1746, and that is the date of the Battle of Culloden. Again, I know I've kind of gone on about this point, but just to highlight again that at the Battle of Culloden there were English and Scottish soldiers on both sides. There were borderers and lowlanders and people who came up to support the Jacobite cause. There were English Jacobites who travelled up to fight, and there were also Highlanders who fought on the Hanoverian side. When they arrived at the battle, largely speaking, it wasn't very good ground for the Jacobites to fight on. They weren't used to fighting in the sort of land that Culloden is, and if you haven't had a look, I would really recommend you go onto the Culloden battlefield website, have a wee look at the information they've got there. It'll tell you much more about the battleground and so on. The Jacobites were tired. A lot of them weren't properly trained soldiers. They didn't all have enough weapons. Whereas the Hanoverian army, by and large, were better trained, they were more rested, they were armed, and they were really hacked off with the Jacobites, and they really wanted this to end. And so the battle ended in a defeat for the Jacobite army, and it was the last battle fought on British soil, and it was also has become infamous for how brutal it was. It was a very bloody battle. I know all battles are, but the way it ended was quite brutal, that people who had supported the Jacobite side were often tracked down in the country and killed. The battlefield was cleared of anybody who had supported the Jacobite cause. Now this is what led to the Duke of Cumberland, who had led the Jacobite army, had led the Hanoverian army there, being called Butcher Cumberland because he was so brutal. It's also worth, when you're looking at your little royal family tree, noting that he and Bonnie Prince Charlie were cousins. So yeah, a very brutal end to the Jacobite risings. One of the legacies of this, there's lots of things that have come from the Jacobite risings, and a lot of legacies from that. But one of the things that happened was the Disarming Act, and that was a piece of law, a piece of legislation passed to try and break down the system that had enabled this to happen. So it tried to break down the clan structure, because obviously in the clan structure, the chief could call everybody together and say, "You're fighting on my side." That's it. And because people had loyalty to their clan chief, they would support him. And so one of the things the Disarming Act tried to do was break down that network of clans. It banned carrying weapons, wearing traditional Highland dress. So a lot of the things that were associated with a Highland identity were dismantled in the Disarming Act. And one of the documents we've got up for you to have a look at on the website is an amazing court document. We have a dozen or so of these, of people who were arrested for wearing tartan after the Battle of Culloden when it had become illegal. And the sentence for a first offence of doing it was 6 months in prison, and then the second, if you did it again, then you could be transported and sent away from the country. So serious punishments. Another legacy of this, because it was so brutal and was such a kind of emotional thing that people were fighting for, one of the legacies has been that it's become very, very romanticized, which means that, you know, a lot of people think it was a romantic time in our history. There's all sorts of amazing stories, and it is a great time, a great interesting period in our history. There's so many stories associated with it. So it has been in a lot of films, it's been in a lot of TV programmes, books, all sorts of things. People still feel quite strongly about the Jacobite risings. One of the most kind of serious legacies of it is that to this day it's still illegal to be a Catholic monarch. So we still don't have anybody who is a Catholic on the throne, and obviously the throne has never passed back to that side of the family. So that's an interesting thing to have a wee look at and research. So as I said, there's all sorts of other things I could tell you about the reinforcing, the building of the wage roads, which enabled troops to travel, building of garrisons and barracks like Fort Augustus, Fort William, Fort George, Ruthven Barracks, Bernera Barracks. There's all sorts of awesome things you can go away and research to do with the Jacobites. The documents that we've got up on the website for you to have a look at, as I say, there are some connected to each rising. I haven't put anything up to do with the 1688-89 rising because we do have them, but they become more and more tricky to read. So I've put up some from 1715, some from the 19, and some from the 45 for you to have a look at, including battle plan of Culloden and someone being arrested for wearing a kilt. So there's all sorts of things for you to look at. One of the other awesome documents we've put up, I'll tell you about two of them. One of them is the official letter that Bonnie Prince Charlie wrote to say that he was raising his standard at Glenfinnan, and what that means is he was putting up his flag to say, "I've landed and I'm here to claim the throne." Now that is from the amazing collections of West Highland Museum, and we've put that up on our website for you to have a look at. I would really recommend having a look at West Highland Museum's website, and then when we're back in a normal world to go and visit them. They have amazing Jacobite collections, as do Inverness Museum and Art Gallery. There's lots of amazing Jacobite collections about. The other one, just quickly, I want to tell you about is a document which is a cipher, which is a code. So quite often, because you couldn't tell people you were a Jacobite sometimes because it was dangerous, because it was being against the government. You were fighting against the government. So sometimes they made all sorts of secret symbols and codes and wrote to each other in secret codes. And we've got an original Jacobite secret code up on the website for you to have a look at. There's all sorts of activities there for you to do, so have a look at writing your own codes, researching the symbols that the Jacobites used, drawing pictures, writing letters, all sorts of things. Like I say, this is one of my absolute favourite subjects. It's just so interesting and full of stories, so I really hope that you enjoy it. I hope that I've shed a little bit of light on it. It's it's a quite a complicated subject. There's a lot of names to get your head around and things, but hopefully this has been helpful. Please do have a look at the activities. Please do some of them, and if you do, take a photo and share them with us with the tag HLH Learn with Lorna so that we can see them, because that would be really awesome. Next week we're going to be looking at health records. Health and well-being, all of the things that make up health and well-being, and some of our awesome health collections that we look after for NHS Highland. So I hope that you can join me again next Thursday at 11 o'clock for Health and Wellbeing Week. But in the meantime, take care of yourselves.